This year marks the 80th anniversary of the Jewish mass deportations from Hungary. A bit of history is therefore in order. Despite its deeply rooted anti-Semitism and its status as an Axis partner of the Nazis, Hungary did not deport its Jews until 1944. The fascist leader Miklos Horthy contented himself with forcing men into labor battalions and sending about 23,000 Jews to be murdered in the massacre of Kamenets-Podolsky. But on the whole, he refused to emulate the genocidal policies of the Nazis, until, that is, the German occupation of the country in March 1944. It should be noted that the bulk of Eastern European Jews had already been murdered by that point, either in the Holocaust by bullet or in the extermination camps in Poland. Although all violent deaths are tragic, there is something uniquely tragic in the destruction of the Hungarian Jewish community so late in the war. The arrival of the Germans in early 1944 initiated a sea change in the Hungarian treatment of its Jews. Within months, dozens of ghettos were established, and in late April, the mass deportations to Auschwitz began. Within the space of a mere 56 days, that's the figure given in the new book by Dan Stone, within 56 days, about 437,000 people were deported to their death. Only a few survived. To commemorate the victims of this conflagration and to honor the survivors, I will now show 3 video clips. The people you encounter were Hungarian Jews who experienced the deportations, and their video testimonies are part of the Shoah Foundation Institute's Visual History Archive, the world's largest database of Holocaust survivors and witnesses. The UC San Diego Library is one of a handful of institutions on the West Coast that offers access to the entire archive. And if you have any questions, I'm the person to pose them to. Our first survivor is Magda Schullerer, whom you see here, who was 20 years old when she was deported to Auschwitz. I'm now going to play a short clip.
And there was more Gestapos and more gendarmeries. So they started, let's say, when the transport arrived, they were starting to push people into the cattle cars, as many they could push in. Like I know in our wagon there was between 80 and 90 people. We were packed like sardines, hardly enough time. If you had enough place just to sit down, but when you sat down, you couldn't get up. You had to hold on to somebody's dress or coat or whatever to get up, because there was no place. We were packed like herrings, and every cattle car get 1 pail water with a tin cup and another pail, an empty pail, for sanitary reasons. And then they shut the cars. I remember the noise what the door made when they bolted the door from outside, and there was only one little, like a brick, that big opening with barbed wire on it, where the air would come in, or who was tall enough could look out there and see what was going on. The same day, later...
Magda, were the Hungarians helping the Germans getting the people into the
That's right.
cattle cars?
The Hungarians who turned to Nazis with the brown shirt and the black tie, and the gendarmeries and some Nazis, not too many. It was a lot more Hungarians and the gendarmerie. And they were yelling, they were cursing, dirty Jew, and whatever you want. I can't even say it in English, the way they were pushing us, and they started to treat us like cattle. We were handled like cattle, pushed in the car brutally and pushing and hitting.
Okay, this was the first excerpt. The second one is from Andrew Weisner, who was born in 1927. He's also going to talk about the deportations for a few minutes.
Or only part of it. We don't know, because we were just herded like sheep, like cattle.
How long were you there for?
Where? In the ghetto? About 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. We were there till during Shavuos. We were still there. We finished Shavuos, we moved. So from Pesach to Shavuos, which is 6 weeks. So during Shavuos, we celebrated yet on this. We had, my father made sure we have a minyan for Shavuos. Once we got on the trains, again, nobody told us where are we going. We just saw these frightening police, German guards. They spoke Hungarian, they spoke German, because they were the Hungarian Volksdeutsche. And they shoved us in like cattle into that car. No blankets, no nothing, but we had to make our own. There was no facilities. Finally, the train started moving. We were on that train a total of 3 days. It moved, it stopped. At one time, about the day after we left the ghetto, from the train moved away, there was children in the car, and some of them were crying. Some of them got sick. So this young couple, so he decided he's going to beg the guard to give him some water for the baby. By that time, there was no more water left. And they didn't issue the water every day. Every day they were supposed to bring in a pail of water, which they did, but not soon enough, and this baby was crying. So the man went over to the opening, and he says to that guard, and he spoke in Hungarian, because these people understood Hungarian, that we should give him a little water, the baby is crying, she's sick. So the guard came over and he shot him. Shot him in the face, and the body fell backwards, back into the freight car.
The final video testimony excerpt is from Agatha Ehrenfried, Judy's mom. She's going to talk about how she arrived in Auschwitz and what she experienced there.
Absolutely. I had no idea. I mean, to me, Auschwitz, I never even heard of Auschwitz at this point. I didn't know what Auschwitz was. And everybody, you know, people were optimistic. They take us to work. There were some people who were more aware. But I was kind of, you know, you start to become kind of numb. It's like getting in a shock. And I do not remember if I ever thought of it what's going to happen. I never thought I'm going to die. I just never even occurred to me.
Now when you arrived and the door is open, can you describe that scene?
Well, when the door is opened, you know what, it was almost like a relief. Oh my God, fresh air. Well, we arrived in Auschwitz in the morning. Auschwitz in the morning is very, very cold. It's a very cold morning. And there are lots of running around, there are lots of commotion, people yelling at you, get out, get out. They are these people in their striped outfit, and they're pulling you out of the cars. And
were there many dead people
they said,
in your car?
I don't know how many, but they were. And they said, old people or sick people, they should stay in the cars, and the ambulance will come and take them away. And the rest of them out, raus. So we got out, and then separating
the men from the women. I mean, it's very fast, everything.
So is that the last time you saw your father?
That's the last time. I couldn't even say goodbye, nothing, just separated, and I was with my mother. Then the women walk in one column, and then we get up to this gate with, Dr. Mengele, and ask me, "Is this your mother?" I said, "Yes." "How old is she?" Well, I didn't think. Now I think back and I feel guilty sometimes, really. Because I thought my mother was 45, whatever. And he sent her to the other side. And my mother looked very young. And if I just could have said, "This is my sister, she's 30, who knew it? Who knew it? And that's the last I seen my mother.
And now I am very honored to ask Judy to come to the podium and say a few words. Thank you for being here.
Okay, that's always rough. That's always a rough one. First of all, Dr. Hillman, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to say a few words tonight. You're so dear to me as you continue to help me keep the memory of Aggie alive. Okay, I'm going to be okay. Monday was my mom's birthday. So to be able to say a few words about her and connect her to the fateful day of her deportation is so apropos. It has always been a sweet irony that her birthday falls on Veterans Day, because the sweetest day of her life, maybe besides the day my brother and I were born, of course, was when the U.S. Army liberated her from a train in the deepest, darkest part of Germany, where her new life began. After watching the clip, I think that you would have to agree that my mom was a remarkable storyteller. Yet the clip leaves so much that we don't know, and because, like so many children of survivors, we just didn't ask. And she even said it herself. I have a different clip of her that I did when she was speaking at San Marcos, so it's a little bit different. But things like, do you remember how you felt when the knock on the door came to leave your house? They left from, they were taken to another home. They were in a smaller town called Rakosliget, and they were in a smaller town. So they went to other people that went from their house to another house where there were many people before they were taken to the train station. Do you remember what your mother and father might have said? Did you wonder how your sister and other relatives would find you? And of course, she would answer just like she did. I was in shock. I don't know. That's what she would have said. I don't remember. I was in shock. I couldn't have imagined. And of course, like the rest of us, as I said, we would be in shock and shutting down. So we talk about the pivotal moment, or the droplet of fate. The moment of the knock on the door, marching to the train station, boarding that train to hell. Much like that movie, Sliding Doors. I don't know if any of you've seen it, but where you don't, in a minute, your life can change and be totally different. Her life changed in an instant. Aggie, as you can see, a beautiful young woman, brought up in an upper-class home, cultured, educated, lover of men, cooking and gourmet omnivore of life, became a prisoner, a displaced person, a refugee, and to some degree, always fragile and a bit broken in one split moment. I'm almost done. I want to talk about something else and end on a positive note. As many of you know, I volunteer as a member of the education team for the Butterfly Project, and we teach Holocaust education in the classroom. In one of our lessons called Through Their Eyes, we tell the story of the Holocaust through the eyes of our parents and other young people. Our parents at that age of the young people we're talking to, who are usually around 12, 13, or 14. And we ask the students to fill out an identity sheet. And we ask them to identify things, places, events, anything that's important to them right now in their current life. And we emphasize and show pictures and share quotes of survivors before the war, emphasizing they were just like you. And at the end of the lesson, we ask them to think about what they wrote and what might not be available to them had they gone through this traumatic experience. So again, in a precious moment, life can change. We use a different clip of my mother talking about deportation. But it's silent in the room. We help them to make connections that these things can happen if we're not upstanders and stand up when we see injustice. Happy birthday, Mom. Trying to make good from the pivotal knock on the door. I think you'd be proud. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy, for these truly heartfelt words. Among the Jews who did survive the Hungarian Holocaust was Béla Pásztor, the father of today's guest speaker, Rafael Pastor. Rafael Pastor is going to talk about his father's experience in conversation with Deborah Hertz, professor of history and co-founder of the Holocaust Living History Workshop. Please join me in welcoming them to the podium.
Well, thank you all for coming out. It's wonderful to see so many students and faculty, staff, community. We treasure our audience, so we thank you for coming. I would just like to start before I introduce Rafael to say that for those of us who work on the workshop and for all historians, the personal is historical. And to be able to have one life viewed through the marvelous and amazing research that's gone into the book, the big, beautiful book, we'll see the picture of it in a minute, is truly a wonderful experience, as sad as the content is. So just briefly introduce Rafael. He's a lawyer. He went to Columbia undergraduate and went to NYU for law school, has been a CEO. There's too many of institutions for me to mention. I just think his father would have loved the conversation about CBS, Fox Video International, banking, Vistage International. I can't even follow all the wonderful things he's done. And he's been in San Diego for over 15 years. 20 years. A very generous donor to the Rady School and Global Policy and Strategy, otherwise known as IRPS from the old days. So it's a pleasure. And now I will sit back in my chair and we will start our slideshow, right? We hope. So the first slide is the wonderful book. And what I want to ask Rafael is, how did the book come about?
So thanks for that question, and thank you all for being here, and thank all of you who are watching this remotely. And thank you most especially for just doing events like this. And it ties into how this book came about, because I think it's really important to remember and to mention all that happened back then. Not only as a tribute to all those people who went through it, many of whom didn't survive, but it's important for people to understand how these things happen and how potentially it could happen again elsewhere in different form. So anyway, thank you for doing these things. The question is, how did this book come about? It came about totally fortuitously. There was this woman named Anna Szalai. She is a Hungarian cultural historian. She lived in Hungary, and then she moved to Israel. And she went to some conference like professors usually do, and she heard a story about my father, who had lived in Israel and in Hungary, and she became interested in his life. And somehow she tracked me down. I'm his only child, out here in California. We got on the phone, and she had already done a ton of research about my father, and we stayed on the phone for about 2 hours. And at the end of it, I said to her, I now know more about my father than I ever did. And she said, well, I'd like to write a book about him. I said, well, please do write the book. She didn't ask me for anything, but I was happy to underwrite it. And off she went, and she did an amazing amount of research. The book is in 3 languages, one book in 3 languages, English, Hungarian, and Hebrew, which kind of reflects his life, with a lot of pictures and a lot of anecdotes, and most of it based on her research. I had some material I sent to her. And what's important about the book to me, not just that I learned a lot about my dad and his times, but my children did, and hopefully our grandchildren will as well. And like Judy just said, and it's in the foreword to the book that I wrote, very often when people go through really terrible things, not always, but often, kids don't ask and parents don't tell. Kids aren't curious enough and parents just don't feel really comfortable talking about it. And it's not just Jews who went through the Holocaust and survived like my dad did. I have a very good friend whose dad was an admiral in the Nazi Navy. He was conscripted. And his dad died when the kid was 19, just like my dad died when I was 16. And when I told this friend of mine, German, about the book they're writing about my father, he said, oh my God, I wish they had written a book about my father, the German admiral who ended up actually in a prisoner of war camp in England. He said, because I know nothing. I never asked, and he never talked about it. And the irony of, I'm a survivor, I'm the son of a survivor, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust in Budapest, having the same experience as this guy whose father was in the German Navy, in terms of not knowing and wanting to know more. That's why events like this are important.
I've divided your father's life into 8 sections, and the red little boxes are the beginning of a section that then ends up at the top. And I wanted Rafael to give us a survey of the amazing peripatetic wanderings of your father.
Thank you. So, as you will notice, my father was born in 1895. He'd be 129 years old today. He was 55 when I was born. He was 23 years older than my mother. So that tells you a lot also about a bit of our separation, because it was generational, not just cultural. Anyway, he was born in 1895. He served in the First World War. He was decorated. He got all sorts of awards. He served for the Hungarian army. The Hungarian army was aligned. It was Austro-Hungary. They were aligned with the Germans. They lost the war, but that's where his loyalties were. And after the war, when Hungary was going through like a lot of other parts of Europe, all sorts of revolutions. He was what today would be called on the leftist side. He was part of those revolutions which didn't succeed, but he ended up being a spokesman for the leaders of the revolution, which failed. He ended up being jailed, not for the last time. He was always there when stuff was happening. And then by the time he got into the 1920s, he was in Budapest, an extremely successful director and producer of movies, owner and producer of theater, sort of a man about town. And it's important to note that by the 1920s, Jews in Hungary were just fine. Hungary liberated its Jews back in the 1860s, liberated them in this sense that Jews were no longer considered a nationality. They were just considered a religion. Otherwise, they were just Hungarians. And I think 1800, there were 100,000 Jews in Hungary. 100,000 Jews in Hungary. By the 1920s, there were over 1 million. It was the second biggest Jewish community in Europe. They were probably second only to Germany, the Jews in Hungary, in the level of assimilation. They were totally assimilated, and they were very influential. While only 5% of the Hungarian population was Jewish, almost a quarter of the Budapest population was Jewish. More than 50% of the professional class, lawyers, doctors, financiers, the cultural elite, were Jewish. They were disproportionately Jewish, and hence very, very influential and very, very free. They were allowed to do what they did, and they did it very well. And I think there's a lesson there relative to what happens later, which is that they had enormous cultural, intellectual, professional influence. They did. They had enormous influence, but they had no political power. They really had no say. And later, when it mattered to have political power, they were left naked. Anyway, they were doing really well. My father was part of that whole world. And life was good. Life was good in the 20s.
Good transition. Okay. So I wonder, no, I kind of have the question right here. If you could talk about his artistic work and his identity.
Identity for him, like for many other people, like, I don't want to get too much in terms of contemporizing it today, but we talk about identity politics a lot today in the context of what's going on politically in the United States. For him, identity was somewhat complicated, but I think relatively clear. I think initially he thought of himself and acted as a Hungarian, first and foremost a Hungarian who happened to be Jewish, because that's how he was brought up. He was not very religious. He knew about his Jewish identity, but first and foremost, he was a Hungarian. He was proud of it. Later on, I think he thought of himself more as a Jewish person who was somewhat unfortunate to have been in Hungary at a very bad time. But nonetheless, that's how he thought about himself. And the movies that he made and the theater that he produced in Budapest, which were very popular, were very authentically nationalistic. They celebrated Hungarian culture, Hungarian folk music, Hungarian humor. And I think he did that in part because it's a popular art form, you know, movies and theater, and he wanted to make it something that Hungarians wanted to go and see and listen to. Later on, I think he did it because when it got tougher for Hungarians and they were no longer allowed to own theaters, which he had done, by then, I think he did it to show, hey, we're doing good Hungarian stuff. It's not Jewish stuff, we're doing Hungarian stuff. But I think most especially did it because he was a proud Hungarian, and that's what he was doing. And until the late 1930s, 38, life was good, as I said. They were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. In 1938, what happened in Hungary was there were these things called numerus clausus, which basically created very, very rigid quotas. There could be only so many Jewish doctors. There could be only so many, literally there were numbers, like 20% could be only Jewish lawyers. Only so many, what percent could go, Jews could go to universities. And a lot of things were forbidden. Jews were not allowed to own movie theaters. They could produce movies. And that was the beginning of a turn from this freedom. But it still, as was already mentioned, it wasn't terrible because it wasn't until 1944, and we'll get to that later, that Jews were actually sent away to concentration camps. So what happened in 1944? What happened in 1944, after a number of years, where Jews, unlike the rest of Eastern and Central Europe, were not sent away were not deported to Hungary, to concentration camps. They did have labor camps, but labor camps didn't kill people. It was just kind of forced labor. They sent Jews to that, but they were okay. And the reason they got away with it for as long as they did is in part because Admiral Horthy, who ran the country, it's a weird thing that the guy who ran the country was an admiral. The country has no navy, it's a landlocked place, but nonetheless, he was an admiral. He was a good guy until he turned to be a bad guy, which wasn't until 1944. But just as I will mention later, that the Hungarian people themselves were active collaborationists, complicit in what happened to the Jews. They were even more enthusiastic than Nazis. The Jewish leadership, there was this thing called the Jewish Council. My grandfather was one of the, on my mother's side, was one of the people who ran the Jewish Council. And they were really, really smart people, except that they were naively stupid because they genuinely believed and were led to believe, but they actually believed it. Yeah, it can happen in Poland. It can even happen to Romania, but it's not going to happen here for a whole range of reasons. Well, then it did happen. And in 1944, Eichmann was in Hungary. And his mission was to get rid of as many Jews as quickly as possible. By then, the Germans were losing the war. You can wonder why they didn't deploy resources to trying to fight the war as opposed to sending Jews off. But it's a very, very grim statistic. Hate to share it with you. But in Poland, they killed 3 million Jews in a span of 39 to 45. 6 years, 3 million Jews. In Hungary, in a span of about 8 months, they got rid of 600,000 Jews. It was even more brutal and more efficient than anything that ever happened anywhere else. And a lot of Jews were sent away. My father and my mother, they weren't married yet, they got married after the war. Each survived in different ways. My father was hidden, and I wish I knew more about this, but I don't. He was hidden by what I was often called a righteous Gentile. He was hidden by a farmer somewhere, God knows where, in a barn during that period. And it was a good thing too, because he was a very visible, well-recognized guy. If he was just walking around the streets, he would have been taken. By then, of course, they had put a lot of the Jews into ghettos to assemble them, so it made them easier to then transport to Auschwitz. But my father was in that group. He survived. My mother, by the way, as I said, they weren't married yet. My mother's father was a very, very, very prominent lawyer in Hungary. He represented, among others, the Swiss in the pre-war period. And during that very terrible period, the Swiss embassy took my grandfather, my mother, and my grandfather's wife into the Swiss embassy. They were hidden there because the Nazis, first of all, respected diplomatic property, which is the Swiss embassy, and Switzerland was neutral during the war. So they weren't going to go in there to find Jews, and they were hidden. And thanks for that, because if it wasn't for the Swiss, I wouldn't be here. There are a lot of bad stories about the Swiss in the context of the Second World War. Not in my family. We like the Swiss. So Wallenberg, the last thing I'll say about him is, he, of course, is the quintessential righteous Gentile. In fact, there's a book about him, among many, many other books about him, called The Righteous Gentile. This was a Swedish diplomat who was stationed in Budapest. And because he had the ability to hand out these so-called Schutzpasses, they were basically documents of immunity that you could just get away with things and not be taken as a Jew. And he went around town doing all that. And he was a great, great man for doing so. And my connection to him is very indirect. And that is that my Uncle George, my mother's brother, worked with Wallenberg. He was part of that whole Schutzpass business. They also had false ambulances. They would go to a Jewish area with something that looked like an ambulance. It was an ambulance. And said, okay, we're saving these people. But they were basically taking them and taking them into the countryside. So the last person, the Soviets took Wallenberg very famously at the end of the war. They captured him and they took him away. And for many, many years during the Cold War, there was always this mystery of what happened to Wallenberg? What happened to Wallenberg? Why did they take it? And there were tons of books written about Wallenberg. And everyone who wrote those books all went to see my uncle, who by then was living in Brussels. And they said to him, since he was the last person to see Wallenberg, where did they take Wallenberg? And he said, hell if I know. I just know that they took him. And it wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Empire or Soviet regime that the archives were opened up and people learned that Wallenberg was actually in a sort of a prison, some kind of a prison in Soviet Russia until 1957, I think it was, when he finally died. But anyway.
So now we're going to, I don't need the mic, we're going to depart from the chronology a little bit for a thematic conversation about how Béla Pásztor managed to always do something the same that was creative in all these different spaces.
You know, I think my father, again, is hardly unique. I think it's pretty common. When you go through all of these historic things and when you go through all these migrations, you have to be adaptive. You have to adjust to different circumstances. And you have to find ways to apply your talent in different countries, in different circumstances, which is pretty true for my father. It turned out, coincidentally, he was one of the very first people to make a movie in Hungary. He ended up being the very first person to create a movie in Israel. It so happens that in Hungary, in the years of the 20s, early 30s, it was Hungarians who were very much in the forefront of the cultural leadership of the country. Well, in Israel, where my parents ended up, it was a bit of the reverse. A lot of the Hungarians were in the forefront of the cultural elite of Israel, including my father. And so it's just, things like that happen. And I think he was able to apply his talents as a movie maker, as a theater person, in different places, in different ways. When they went to Israel, the very first movie that was made after the state was declared by the UN was made by my father. It was a documentary about Israeli artists. First movie made in Israel, in the modern Israel. And then he realized there were about 400,000 Hungarians living in Israel who didn't speak Hebrew. Like my parents never spoke Hebrew. At home, they spoke Hungarian. I didn't learn Hebrew until I first went to school. I still speak Hungarian fluently. I hardly speak any Hebrew. So there are 400,000 somewhat cosmopolite Hungarians in Israel. They like theater, but they can't go to the theater in Israel because it's in Hebrew. They don't speak Hebrew. So my father basically invented a theater group that went around the country to these Hungarian communities, and they put on plays in Hungarian for them. They put on Dialogue for Murder in Hungarian. They put on The Diary of Anne Frank in Hungarian, a bunch of other things. And he assembled a troupe of very talented Hungarian actors and set designers, some of whom I got to know. And he put on these shows. Many of them also, like him, were talented people back in Hungary who ended up in Israel, and now they were doing theater together. So that's what I think people have to do when you go through all of this. You got to be adaptive. You might say you have to be opportunistic, seize the opportunities as you see them.
I want to ask a little sub-question here, and that is about ideology as compared to practicality in those Israel years. 10 of them, right? 48 to 58. What's the motive here for going to Israel?
That's a great question. My parents, my father especially, they were not Zionists. They didn't go out there, like many people did, out of some sense of conviction that this is the place where Jews should go. It was really a matter of convenience. After the war, they survived the war, as I mentioned. They then lived under a Soviet kind of regime in Hungary. They hated the communists probably almost as much as the fascists, and they wanted to get the hell out of Hungary. So they went to Switzerland, where my grandfather ended up living at the Savoy Hotel. He ended up dying there. He's buried in Zurich. And they wanted to stay in Switzerland. Well, the Swiss said to them, no, you can't stay here. So they said, okay, we'll go to America. The Americans wouldn't give them a visa for whatever reason. Well, Israel was open to all Jews. All you have to do is be Jewish and you can come there. That was the whole idea of the country. So they went to Israel. As I said, more out of almost default convenience. And then he ended up doing all the things I said he had done. And my mother also lived there. I think Israel in the 50s was not like Israel today. It was kind of a backwater, relative certainly to cosmopolitan Budapest, where both my parents grew up. And while they were, I think, very much integrated to the sort of Hungarian intelligentsia, the Hungarian elite, Israel, which they, of course, were fully supportive of as a country and as Jews, was never as much of a home to them as the good old days of Budapest were, nor was it as much of a home for them as aspirationally they thought the United States could be, especially for their only son, which was me. So
I want to say that we had this wonderful breakfast yesterday where I learned a lot of the lower levels of the story, and I was absolutely gripped by the way that Rafael described his father's relationship to Berlin as contrasted to Budapest. This, by the way, is a Soviet soldier in Budapest.
So my father, in 1958, having lived in Israel for 10 years, got up and left and went to Berlin. We followed him about 8 months later. I'll get to that. And he went to Berlin for, I think, 3 reasons. One, it was hard to make ends meet in Israel, especially in the businesses they were involved with. They were comfortable, but it was still a struggle. So the Germans were actually beginning to pay reparations. And my father put in a claim, which he thought he could advance by being in Germany, which he did. He ended up getting checks for the rest of his life. That was one reason. The second reason was that I think he just felt, in an odd way, more comfortable in Germany. He was quintessentially, not just a Hungarian, but he was quintessentially a Central European, linguistically, culturally, gastronomically, all those wonderful cultural things that you would associate with Central Europe, and including Germany before the war, that was part of him. He actually lived in Germany in the 1930s. He ran a chain of movie theaters in Budapest in the good days for a company called UFA. UFA was the biggest film company in Europe. I think in the world at that time. It was pre-Hollywood. And the Germans, UFA, put him in as CEO in Budapest. I told you, he served in the First World War alongside the Germans and so forth. I'm not saying he was a German lover, but I would say that he was culturally comfortable in there. And last but not least, he ended up doing some very interesting things. I'll get to that. He ended up doing some very interesting things in Germany. He was in a couple of movies. He continued to write articles back to the newspaper that he had always wrote articles for. I had forgotten to mention that. In Israel, there was this daily newspaper called Uykelet, and he was a writer, very, very creative, good writer for them. And he wrote articles from Germany back to them about all sorts of things that were going on in Berlin. Don't forget, this was the period when Berlin was the center of the world as far as the Cold War was concerned. He wrote articles about what are the Germans' reaction to Eichmann trial back in Jerusalem. Kind of interesting stuff. He wrote articles about the premiere of Judgment in Nuremberg, which was premiered in Berlin. And there are pictures in the book about him with Maximilian Schell and Judy Garland and all of that. And he was the vice chairman or vice president of the Foreign Press Association in Berlin. At a time when the wall went up, I was there when the wall went up, that's a whole other story. At the time when all of this friction was going on, centralized in Berlin. So it was like an interesting place for him to be. I never asked him this question, which continues to puzzle me. He was willing to go back to Berlin, despite all that they had done in Budapest. He refused to set a foot in Hungary ever again. His sister, who he loved, still was alive in Hungary. He could have gone to visit her. He was free to do that. She could not come out because she wouldn't be given a visa. He never went back. He hated the Hungarians so much that in a sense, I'm not sure he hated them more than the Germans, but somehow he was, as that prior slide said, he felt Germany was more hospitable, whereas he would not ever go back to Hungary, and he never did. So what's your question here? Yes.
Yes. Well, for those who follow Hungarian history, especially in the catastrophic year of 1944, will surely come across Rudolf Kastner. And those who follow Israeli history will know that he went on trial in a complicated case that had to do with his organizing of this train of over 1,600 Hungarian Jews that left Budapest for the West. And he was assassinated in Tel Aviv. His granddaughter is Merav Michaeli, who was the head of Meretz or the Labor Party. Anyway, I just thought, like Wallenberg, this is a personality that will coincide with Raphael's life, and sure enough, it did.
So, Custer, for those who are into this stuff, I don't know how many books have been written about this. I think there have been at least 3 documentary films. So Custer was this Hungarian guy who, back in Budapest, ended up negotiating with Eichmann. And he was able to trade art, jewelry, all from Jews in exchange for lives. And he very famously created this train on which, I forget, but hundreds of Jews were on this train, including people I got to know later on, who were saved by him and his dealings with Eichmann. And he, Pastor, ended up in Israel, just like my parents did. They were very good friends. There's a picture in the book of a birthday of mine in Israel, and you can see Kastner's daughter, Zhuzi, who's the mother of the Mirav, they were just pals. So what happened to Kastner was, there was a series apparently of articles saying that he actually collaborated with the Germans because he dealt with them. He must have been doing something improper. And there was a big brouhaha about that, and he ended up being assassinated. I think there were 3 guys who killed him. I think there was 3 of them. And the 3 guys somehow got off. And this became a big, big thing in Israel. Israel, like anywhere where there are a lot of Jews, ends up being a place where people disagree a lot. You can see what's going on there now. And this was a big point of contention between those who thought Kastner was a good guy and those who thought he was a Nazi collaborator. And he got off. Ultimately, that got reversed and all of that. But it was a big, big controversy. And I know nothing more about it than I just told you. You can read all sorts of books about it, but I do know this. He was a good friend of my parents. I was 6, 7 years old, so it's not exactly something I discussed with them. But I'm convinced that if I had discussed it with them, they would have said, he's a wonderful guy, he's heroic, he's courageous, he did a lot of good. Which I think is the impression that a lot of people today have when they look back on it. But so much for him and so forth.
Now, this is a little venture for me down my own memory lane, because if any of you hang out in New York City up on the Upper West Side by Columbia, you'll have to go to the Hungarian pastry shop and you'll have to gorge yourself on Hungarian pastries. And so I thought that would be a way to bring us a little closer to Raphael's childhood, adolescence.
So I see somebody from Columbia College. You know the pastry shop? Did you go to Columbia? Are you still there, or are you the graduate? Okay. So it's an apt, Deborah found this picture. It's very apt because I did go to Columbia and I did go to this pastry shop, but Deborah was asking me about how, what is my sense of identity? And I can tell you, I have zero pride in my Hungarian heritage. I don't feel myself to be a Hungarian. I do like their strudel and their other food, and I respect a lot of the cultural stuff that they've done throughout the centuries and so forth, or at least the last few centuries. But I do think of myself very proudly as someone who was born in Israel. I still have an affinity for that country. I care a lot about it, though I left when I was 9 years old. Way more than Hungary. Hungary is just a language that I speak really well and is obviously where my parents are from. But at the end of the day, I'm like most people who come here, especially at an early age, I think of myself as an American. And your question to me was, well, how has all this story affected me? And I can tell you this, as I look back on my parents, both of them, who went through a lot of stuff, not immigrations, Holocaust, struggling in Israel, moving here, moving there, all of that. I don't remember a single time when they were negative in the sense of they never thought of themselves as victims. There was no victimization going on in my household. They were always forward-looking. They lost a lot, they regained it, they lost it again, they regained it, but they were always forward-looking. They were always optimistic. They were always very, very grateful for the opportunities that they were given, despite all the difficulties they had. And maybe most especially in the case of my mother, the opportunity that she had by coming to this country, and the opportunity it afforded me as her son. And so I think the effect of all this, you can go to a dark place as a result of all that they went through, or you can go to a place of light, which is where I ended up. And I'm very grateful to them for that. And I think it's maybe precisely because they went through all of that that they were more grateful, more appreciative, took less for granted, precisely for all the hardship or all the challenge. And I think that's how it affected me.
The reason I put up this slide at the end is because we historians, we have spent a lot of time talking to dead people, right? What would we say to Napoleon? What would we say to Bismarck? How would we have done this differently? All sorts of counterfactuals. And so because Rafael lost his father at such a young age, and because he's learned so much through this amazing book, I thought it would be interesting for him, insofar as he feels okay sharing it, to talk about what he would say to his father.
Yeah, I mean, I guess all of us have questions we would have liked to ask our parents or grandparents, because none of us know as much as we really should about all that. And they all influenced us in very profound ways, and we don't know enough about them. I would, among other things, I would ask my father, so I still don't quite get it, going back to Berlin, but not going to Budapest? Explain that to me. I can surmise, but I can't really get that. I would ask him, and I think our breakfast yesterday, you kind of asked me this question, but I have no answer, is what, if anything, would you have done differently at any stage in your life? And the answer may be no. Either I like the choices I made, or I really didn't have a lot of choices to make. I don't know. But that's a good question, I think. And the last one is, which goes to one of the questions you did ask me, and that is, how is all this migration and opportunity and change, et cetera, how, if at all, did it change you? Or were you always pretty much the same in terms of your values and your outlook and so forth? I would ask him that. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is that there's probably more stability and constancy and consistency in his life, despite all that went on, than there is tumult within himself. The tumult that surrounds him doesn't necessarily come inside of him. That's my guess, but I don't really know. But I think, one of the lessons of character, not just my father, but generally, is if you have a strong character with really gifted talents like he did, and if you have a certain set of beliefs about fundamentally what's right and what's wrong, it kind of becomes your guide throughout. And that doesn't change very much. Again, internality, I think, stays pretty steady Eddie, even while the world around you is sometimes going crazy and actually does bad things to you and to other people.
Good advice for the present. Okay, we're going to open up to questions now. First, let's have a round of applause.
Go ahead, Mark. You have a question? I do. This is my good friend, Mark Holland.
Rafael, your dad was very creative, talented in the entertainment industry, and you ended up on the business side of the entertainment industry. What do you think the conversation he would have had with you regarding that?
So thank you for asking that, Mark. I wrote in this book, which I had very little to do with, but I did write a foreword in it, and I did make the point that, somewhat ironically, maybe not ironically, both my father and I ended up in the entertainment industry. He was running theaters in Hungary, and movie theaters especially. At one time, I was the CEO of one of the biggest chain of movie theaters in America. He worked for newspapers, he wrote for them. I worked for a company that was the largest newspaper owner in the world at one time. And the point of all that, there are two big distinctions between me and my father, and this is what I would have told him if he asked me that question. He wouldn't have had to ask me because he would have seen it, and that is this. First of all, in the film and TV industry, which I was part of, there are two types of people. There's talent, and then there are suits. Well, he was talent. They're the directors, they're the actors, they're the screenwriters, they're the people who actually create that magic. And then there's suits. They're the lawyers and administrators and presidents and CEOs and all that. I was that. So I have a far higher regard for the talent and for the suits. And the only reason I became a suit in that industry is because I knew I had no talent. So therefore I could be close to the talent. But the second thing I would say to him is maybe a little more profound, and that is that while I was, thank God, lucky enough to be pretty successful in a lot of the things I did in a lot of the companies I ran, in a highly, highly competitive industry, when you think of a media and entertainment, it's a pretty cutthroat place. And despite all that, I did okay. It's nothing compared to the hardships he had to survive. You know, to climb the corporate ladder, to go this way or that way, nothing compared to what he had to do. So that's my answer. That's a tough question to beat. Go ahead.
Did your parents ever, as life went on, embrace more Judaism, more spirituality, or did they stay more,
No.
I don't know what the word is. No.
The simple answer is no. I think their sense of Jewishness was cultural. It was hereditary. It was something that they imparted to me. But they were very assimilated Jews in Hungary. And I can tell you a little anecdote. When my mother and father ended up in Israel, since they had been members of a synagogue in Hungary, in fact, my grandfather on my mother's side was president of the Dohányutca synagogue, which is the biggest synagogue in Europe, beautiful place. My mother ended up in Israel, and she said to a friend of hers, you know, we were members of the synagogue in Budapest, which synagogue should we join here? And this friend of hers said, you don't have to join any synagogue. The whole country is a synagogue. So we were never, ever members of a synagogue for the 9 years that I lived there. So then we come to New York, and we know some people there. Well, everyone's a member of a synagogue, and I have to become bar mitzvah. So we joined a synagogue for the first and only time. And that's a whole other story. But the point is, no, I don't think they ever became more religious than they ever were.
I just was wondering if you knew if when your dad left Israel and went to Berlin and was there, was he treated well by the Germans? He was?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this, because I forgot. It's the only thing I wrote down that I wanted to read. Yes, he felt comfortable. He was very much accepted. He was there from 58 to about 63. My parents were effectively separated. He came to America. I went to visit him. My mother visited him. He came to America, saw her. But they were effectively separated until 63. Then he came here, and then he died 3 years later. But I think he was very nicely accepted. But what he did write in one of these articles, which I think is really good, that he sent back to Hungary, he wrote this in Berlin about the Germans. He says, I'm living along with them, neither with them or among them, just along with them. That's an interesting concept. It's not so much about isolation, which is what your question implies. I don't think he felt isolated. I think it's really much more about alienation. That when you're in a society where you're being nicely treated, you even feel you kind of fit in, but you have a sense of alienation. You live along with them, not with them. That's what he wrote. A good answer to your question.
I know you said that you never felt Hungarian, but have you ever been or wanted to go to Budapest and see the life?
I went to Budapest the first time when I was 18 years old. Hungarian is a god-awful, really difficult language, and I speak it like a Hungarian. And I went there, I was 18 years old, and all the people I spoke to said, when did you leave? A lot of people left in 56 during the revolution there, or the attempted revolution there. And I said, I've never been here in Hungarian. And they didn't want to believe me because nobody learns this damn language outside of Hungary. But yeah, I've been there, and I've been back a few times. Because of this book and the woman who wrote it, I rediscovered some cousins of mine who I didn't even know. On my father's side, my wife and I went to Budapest for the book, and we had a dinner with 15 people who were all my cousins. And yeah, so I've been back a few times. It's a beautiful city. It still suffers from anti-Semitism in a serious way, even though there are very few Jews left. And again, I go there Just, I don't know why, but I don't feel like, oh, this is my homeland at all. I don't want it to be my homeland for historic reasons.
What do you think about the sort of rising level of Holocaust in the world today? I think I read an article that around a third of young people in America, to some level or another, essentially dismiss the Holocaust.
Don't what?
They dismiss that the Holocaust happened, or that it was very minor.
Don't believe it.
Yeah.
A third of the Americans, a third of Americans, or third American students, or American youth don't believe it happened.
Or that if it happened, it was a very minor amount of people.
Oh, it was just a minor little thing. What do I think about that? Well, if that's true, that's awful, right? Not only because it's a proven fact, it is a historic fact. There's no, there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of evidence to the contrary, to sound like a lawyer. But I do think that it is, again, not to get too contemporary, but this is my own view. I think it is part of this ignorance-based thing that's going on in this country, which has been happening for decades, long before October 7th, where there's been some indoctrination at university campuses. There's been a fair amount of media left-wing proselytizing. And I think most of it comes down to this notion that there are only two types of people in the world, victims and victimizers. And increasingly Jews, including especially Israeli ones, are being seen as victimizers. And everyone forgets their long, long history of being victims. Because that history goes back for not hundreds of years, but thousands of years, through all sorts of pogroms. So I think that thing is born out of ignorance, but the ignorance is being fed by people who should not be doing the feeding.
Hi. You were talking about your father being in a farmhouse, being sheltered, and then suddenly he was in Israel. Is there a story going from the farmhouse to Israel?
It was part of Deborah's slides. The answer is yes. So the war ended in 1945, and my parents didn't leave. They got married after the war, and they left in 48. So in between that period, they were in Hungary. My father went back into the film business and the theater business. But now the communists were in charge. And there were all sorts of restrictions, not so much about being a Jew, but censorship stuff. This is what you could show. This is what you could not show. This is what you could laugh at. You could not, among other things, celebrate Hungarian authentic nationalism the way you used to, because now it is a whole different regime. And I know he hated it, which is one of the reasons they left. And I said before, I think he hated the communists almost as much as the fascists. The one difference was that the communists didn't kill the Jews as rapidly as the Nazis did and the Hungarians did. But yeah, they were there for about 3-4 years, and then they went to Switzerland. They couldn't stay. They couldn't come to America, so they ended up in Israel. So I'm sorry I skipped that, but can't cover everything. The book has it all. You can get the book on Amazon.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and reflecting on your father's past. I'm really curious. It's clear that your father was burdened by all of the ramifications leading up to and after the war, and then with, the effects of the communists and Russia's ascendancy, so to speak, or I should say the Soviet Union. And what I'm curious about is whether or not you feel that your father was in any way haunted by the experience of all that happened to, I'm sure, family members and the community around him. Did he ever share, or your mother for that matter, was that ever part of your sense of his energy, or was it all just looking forward like you described?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I said, I don't know the answer to your question as it relates to my father. only because we never really had a conversation about it. Partly because he was absent for part of the time I was around, and partly because of what I said before, kids don't ask, parents don't tell. So, and there were members of his family who did go up, who were killed in Auschwitz. But I never actually discussed that with him. So I can't tell you whether he was haunted by it or not. But my guess would be that's one of the reasons he never wanted to go back to Hungary, because he knew that the Hungarians, along with the Germans, caused that to happen. As far as my mother goes, with whom I did have a lot more conversations about things, she had other members of her family who were annihilated, and I was always brought up to know that there were bad people in the world and there were good people in the world. And while she wasn't belaboring that, because I said she was not that much talking about the past, it was about the future, I know that she deeply felt badly about what happened to other people. That's just the kind of person she was. But I think she kept it more inside than outside. But you don't, because you keep it inside, doesn't mean it's not a part of you. In a way, it becomes even more of a part of you than if you extrapolate it, right?
Hi, thank you for this.
This is going to be a Columbia College question?
Maybe, somewhat related, but as Jewish students, as Israelis, we face a lot of anti-Semitism today. I've faced this on both campuses in Columbia and at UCSD, and we see it rising, sort of parallel to what happened, previously in the 1940s. So what advice do you have for us to maybe how to get through this, which we see?
How to get rid of anti-Semitism?
Or how do we face it with the same strength?
Or how to get through it, or how to get... Well, get rid of it, that's a question that's been kind of a conundrum for a few thousand years. I think there's a better chance of getting rid of cancer than there is of anti-Semitism, not to be too negative, but I really do believe that. How to get through it? I'll tell you a little anecdote about Columbia. And I never thought of it until you asked that very good question. But it actually makes me think that this might be a way. A few years ago, my daughter was applying to colleges. And we went to visit a bunch of colleges, including Columbia, Barnard, Williams, that she ended up at Williams and all that. And every college you go to, I'm sure you experienced this also, on the tour that the other kids give you, they all stop and they say, we've got diversity here. We've got every race, every color, every religion, every nation. We've got everything you can imagine at our campus. And they all tell you that, and it's all true. And when I went to Columbia, there was a guy and a girl who were giving us the tour, my daughter and I, with some other people. And we stopped, and the girl goes into her diversity. We got all sorts. This is before DI kind of diversity. This is actually more real diversity, in my opinion. Anyway, she goes into her whole shtick about diversity, which I had heard about in every other college that I went to with my daughter. And then the guy on the tour says, and this may be an answer to your question, and it's not only Columbia, but I think it's especially Columbia, or maybe the way Columbia used to be, I'm not sure anymore. He says, in Columbia, we not only build diversity around you, we build diversity within you. Because of our contemporary civilization courses, which are mandatory, because of our humanities courses, which are mandatory. All of you who don't go to Columbia, what it's all about, it's necessary. If you can be an engineer, you can be a biology major, you got to take these courses. And these courses are about, one of them is about the great thinkers of all time, going back to Plato, and the other is about the great writers of all time, going back to Homer, all the way to and that notion of being diversity within you, of understanding different cultures, connecting the dots among different ways of thinking across different centuries, it gives you a much more upgraded level of looking at things than the here and now, which is what I think happens too often these days. particularly with the whole Palestinian-Israeli divide on campuses. So I think maybe the answer to your question is the one that this guy from Columbia said, and it's true, to build diversity within people, not just externally, so that they see things multifacetedly is maybe a way to get them away from the kind of prejudice of which anti-Semitism is a prime but not the only example. Maybe.
Thank you so much.